Hello, everyone. We are back and we're going to continue our look at the historical books of the Old Testament. Again, my name is Dr. Fran, and we'll take a look at starting with the book of Ruth. If you recall, as we go through the Bible and we talked about the historical books, Ruth is the next part of the history that's listed in the Bible in the order of the book's appearance. We do see that Ruth is something that takes place during the time of Judges. If you look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, it says that specifically during the time of the Judges. And one of the judgments you would assume is that there was a famine that took place. Maybe it was a result of a judgment from God. Maybe it was a result of the war and oppression that took place. But needless to say, there was a difficult time there. Let me also mention, and this is in relation to the oppression that took place in the time of Judges, a couple of things. Number one, I realized that I forgot to mention about Gideon, who is one of those important judges for Israel, who with 300 men just absolutely tore into the oppressors in the time of Judges. But let me also mention to you that Ruth is a story about it's a love story, but it's a story about a woman who was, of all places, of all people groups, a Moabite. And if you recall the story of Ehud and Eglon, King Eglon was a Moabite king, and Ruth was part of the Moabite people. And so this is what is amazing about Ruth and the story of Ruth, is that she is accepted as one of God's own people eventually. And even more remarkable than that, she is in the lineage of David, the grandmother of David, and she is also in the lineage, listed in the lineage of Jesus Christ. So this just shows what a forgiving and amazing and merciful God we have to have this take place. So let me just tell you the quick highlight story of the book of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite woman, but the story begins with a man and his wife. His wife's name was Naomi. Elimelech was a man's name. His wife's name was Naomi. And I don't want to say too many names because you can start to mix them up. But you can read it in Scripture in chapter 1. It's right here, okay? But when you look at it, you've got remember the name Naomi, this woman named Naomi. Her husband and their sons go out of the land of Israel into Moab because of a severe famine in the town and the area that they were in Israel, and probably in all of Israel. And the town that they came from was Bethlehem in Judah. They came from Bethlehem. And so that was their hometown. It kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Bethlehem. That was their place of origin. But they ended up in Moab, and their sons were there. And Naomi found tragedy in the land of Moab, and her husband Elimelech had passed away. He had died. And then she had her two sons who married Moabite women, one named Ruth, the other named Orpah. Quick side fact, Orpah probably sounds a lot like Oprah Winfrey. Orpah is actually the correct name, Orpah. Oprah was named after Orpah, but they misspelled the name, and it just stuck. So she's actually, that's really her name is Oprah or Orpah, but of course because it's spelled as Oprah, that's what they did. So interesting fun fact, right? So Ruth and Orpah are married to these two sons of Naomi, and then the sons died, and so here after about 10 years. Naomi lost her husband, lost her two sons, and is left with the two widows, three widows together. Now, they did not have assistance. They did not have government assistance. They didn't have any kind of a setup by the government for widows. Widows had to beg or get a new husband. Naomi was too old for a new husband, she felt, but she knew that Ruth and Orpah were younger ladies and could easily find a new husband and could easily have new children, and they could live in their people's land, and she could leave. So she said she is going to go back, and each one of you, she told the two young ladies, go back to your mother's home. Well, they didn't want to do that. Both Orpah and Ruth said, no, we insist on coming with you. And Naomi said, no, I insist you go back. Well, Orpah took her up on it. Ruth did not. Famous words in chapter 1, verse 16, Ruth replied, do not plead with me to abandon you or return and not follow you. Listen to this. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may the Lord punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Man, what a commitment, what an honorable thing. She did not want to leave her mother-in-law alone in this state. And she went with her. And so they traveled and they went back to Bethlehem. Naomi is this native to Bethlehem, but Ruth is part of the tribe, part of the people who were hated by the people of Israel, the Moabites. And so the town was excited about Naomi, and they were, wow, this is Naomi, and they saw Naomi, and it's very interesting when they saw Naomi. I wonder if they didn't recognize her quite, because it's been 10 years. Number one, people get older. But the second thing they say is this Naomi? Now, the name Naomi means pleasant. Imagine having a daughter that you named her Pleasant, right? You can't help but say, what, pleasant, and to have a little smile to your face, right? Treat her a little bit different. Naomi said, don't call me Pleasant. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter. I'm renaming myself as bitter. Now, there's a couple things wrong with that. Number one, you don't rename yourself. God renames you if he's going to do so, if he so chooses to do so, like he did with Jacob to Israel, Abram to Abraham, right? In this case, she's rebelling, she's bitter, she's hateful, she's worn out, she's dry. And this is kind of a feeling of the mood of the people, even in that era of Judges, right? Well, Ruth is with her, and I mentioned already that there's no social programs. There's no government social programs. So Ruth and Naomi have to find a way to eat, to live, and God, thankfully, through the law, had given a provision. See if I can do a little drawing here. He gave a little provision here, and the provision is this. If you have if you have a land, okay, and it's somewhat square, and you're farming this land, you are to farm the land, but leave the corners to the people. In other words, harvest, but leave the corners to the people who are in need. Okay? So all this corner space that they do not harvest, forgive my horrible drawing with a mouse, all this corner space that they do not harvest is, these are harvests that are left for the people of who are in need, the people who are in need. So, that's a very interesting thing that God had allowed this to happen and actually commanded them to do that. So people would follow the harvesters, and by the way, the harvesters, if they dropped a grain, if they dropped something, they could not pick it up. They left that also for the people. So people would follow these harvesters and hoping they would drop seed, and they would pick up the seed off the ground behind them. They would harvest the corners, and they could have something to take care of themselves. Genius. I think it's genius. And so Naomi encouraged Ruth to do that. And so she found a place, and she found a place that she went to, and we find this in chapter 2. And so she went and she found a place, she found a field, she gathered grain behind the harvesters, and it just so happened to be the field of a man named Boaz, who was a relative to Naomi, a close relative, the second closest relative that there was to Naomi's husband, the second closest. And that's significant, and there's a reason for that. So eventually he sees Ruth and he's like, wowzers, he's like, wow, who is this woman, right? And they find out later on, he finds out that it's Ruth, who is the daughter-in-law of Naomi. He's fallen in love with this woman. And Naomi and Ruth eventually goes back, tells Naomi where she was at. Boaz gave her some gifts. Naomi said, oh, wow, that's Boaz. He's my kinsman redeemer. Or he could be, He would be one of our closest, our family redeemers. He's one of our redeemers. Now, say, what is a kinsman redeemer? The Levirate marriage is part of that, okay? That kind of a marriage, a Levirate marriage is where me and my wife, and I were to pass on, my brother or my closest living relative to me would need to marry my wife to do the honorable thing, have a child, and that child would take on my name to continue my name. And it was a necessity because of the way the lands work, inheritances work, and all that. So he was a redeemer, Boaz was. And this is a way to carry on a name. The problem was he wasn't the redeemer. He wasn't the kinsman redeemer. There was actually a guy who was closer. Now, eventually, I can't get into the details because we time, but the details eventually happen where this kinsman redeemer, this Goel, okay, kinsman redeemer, this agent of God, is going to redeem Ruth and basically marry Ruth, have a child, and it would carry on her dead husband's name, and she would have honor. It would be an honorable thing to do. Well, Boaz is in love with Ruth. There's another kinsman redeemer that's closer to Naomi, or closer to Ruth's husband, Naomi's husband even, than Boaz was. So this is what happened, and you'll find this in chapter chapter 4. And so we see what happens with Boaz. And I want to read this a little bit because I think it's really interesting how this happens. Boaz went to the gate of the town and sat down there, and the family redeemer, the closest one, the kinsman redeemer, he came by, and Boaz said, come over here and sit down. And they sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men. So you got this thing that's happening. It's like a contract. And he says to the 10 men, sit here, these elders. And they sat down. He said to the redeemer, he said, Naomi, who came back from a territory of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should inform you. Buy it back in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. And if you want to redeem it, then do it. Because he's redeeming his land. He's the closest one. He's in inheritance. But if you want to do it, fine. If you don't want to do it, then tell me, because I'm the next one in line, basically. The kinsman redeemer says, I want to redeem it. Then Boaz said, okay. Well, on the day you buy that field, you also will acquire Ruth, the Moabitess, right? The Moabitess, the wife of the deceased man, to perpetuate his name on her property. And the redeemer said, whoa, hold on there. I can't do that because I'll ruin my own inheritance. And you could take my right of redemption. I can't claim it. So, They did a weird contract with removing the sandal and giving it to the other guy. That was how they sealed the contract in those days. And so Boaz bought the land and took on Ruth as his wife. And all the people were witnesses. Boaz and Ruth then are married, and she becomes pregnant, and eventually Boaz, his child, Obed, is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David. Grandmother Ruth is the great grandmother of David. So there's a huge transition here that takes place. It's pretty amazing, So the theme here then is there's a kinsman redeemer. Now, the family redeemer for the people of Israel, there's not that much of a stretch then to see that there's a redeemer in Christ. And we see Christ all over this. The big story of the gospel then is that Christ is seen through this, and that just as Boaz redeemed his family and saved this lineage, Christ has redeemed us. Here's something else interesting. This man who is closer than Boaz was as a redeemer, who wanted to preserve his inheritance and in essence preserve his name, this man had tried to preserve his name, ended up, we don't know who his name is. It doesn't say his name in Scripture. Boaz, who didn't care about his own name, well, we know his name. And so that's the story of Ruth. And it leads us into the next line, the next book, and it leads us into the books about the last judge and the first and second kings. Okay, this is the book of Samuel, and the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, begins to tell us a little story about Samuel. And Samuel's all about how he becomes a judge. It begins with a very touching story. You need to read it. It's a beautiful story of Hannah, chapters 1 and 2. Hannah, who is childless, who prays to God, and God gives her a son, and she consecrates him to God and gives him to become a priest. And Samuel eventually becomes a judge. And the first 7 chapters of 1 Samuel talks about that. But then we see the pressure that the people of Israel, who have by now seen this need to have a king, this desire, they've been kind of a confederacy of different independent tribes. They need to become one. They need to become one place, one nation, one monarch. So they think they need this king. The truth is they needed the king, God, and follow his laws instead of following their own ways, but that wasn't to take place. So God in chapter 7 we see how Samuel judged Israel throughout his life, and then in chapter 8 it talks about how the elders of Israel said to him, look at verse 5, to Samuel, look, don't think I'd like it if people told me like this. Look, you're old. Your sons don't walk in your ways. So therefore appoint a king to judge us the same as all the nations have. In other words, we want a king like all the other nations' kings. And so a story of Samuel getting Saul is an important story. It's a good story. Again, for time's sake, we won't have time to get into it, but you can read on it. Eventually, Saul, who is of the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest tribe, Saul becomes king. He's a handsome guy. He's a tall guy. I imagine him to be like a quarterback, right, or something. Mr. Quarterback, Mr. Prom King. Head and shoulders above everybody else. And the people see right away, oh, yeah, if anybody's going to be king, it's this Saul guy. That's a good-looking guy, that Saul guy. But Saul had a problem, and his problem was he was impulsive. He was selfish. He was scared of his power to hold on to it, and so he trusted in his politics versus the Lord's power. Eventually, we see that Saul fails God in sacrificing. And then later on in chapter 15, we see a turning point in Saul's kingdom. And I want you to look at chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, where Samuel told Saul, he said, look, listen to the words of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. I have seen what the Amalekites have done to the Israelites when they oppose them along the way. Now go and attack the Amalekites and destroy them completely. Don't spare them. So Saul goes and he gets his troops and he goes to the Amalekites and they attack the Amalekites and destroy many of them, but not all of them. Remember, the order was destroy them completely, wipe them off the face of the earth. He actually captures the king named King Agag and brings him back. Samuel is away, and Samuel hears from the Lord, I have regretted that Saul is king, from God, saying this. He said, he has not carried out my instructions. And Samuel cried out all night. He grieved. He was angry. He goes back and he goes to confront Saul, and he says to Saul, he said, Saul says to him, hey, may the Lord bless you. I've carried out all the Lord's instructions. And Samuel says this, he says, oh, really? What's that sound of the bleating of the sheep that I hear? What's that sound that I hear of the cattle and the sheep and the goats? What is that sound that I hear? He knew it was from the Amalekites. And Saul said, the troops, they brought them from the Amalekites to sacrifice them as a worship to the Lord our God. But the rest we destroyed. Samuel said, stop. Just stop. Stop it, Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And Saul said, okay, tell me. And Samuel said, even though you were once in the smallest tribe of Benjamin, the least important, you considered yourself to be not worthy of this title. Haven't you become the king of Israel? And the Lord anointed you, and he sent you on a mission, and he said, go and destroy these sinful Amalekites and fight against them. So why didn't you obey the Lord? He said, why did you plunder the Amalekites and take their stuff? Why did you do what was evil in the Lord's sight? And Saul said, I did obey the Lord. See how he's justifying. He said, I went on the mission and I brought back King Agag and I completely destroyed the Amalekites and the troops took the sheep and the goats and they did it as a sacrifice to the Lord. And again, he repeats, to sacrifice to the Lord, your God. Samuel said, does the Lord take pleasure in sacrifices or does he take pleasure in obedience? Ouch. What? And he says to obey God is better than a sacrifice. To pay attention to God is better than sacrificing the fat of a ram. He said, because when you're when you're rebellious against God, it's like the sin of divination or witchcraft. When you rebel, it's like wickedness. It's like idolatry. And you've rejected the word of the Lord, and now you're going to be rejected as king. And Saul then says, oh, I have sinned. But I was afraid of the Lord, of the people, so I obeyed them. So please forgive my sin. Samuel said, no, I won't. And as he turned, Saul grabbed his coat and it tore, which was a definite representation tearing your clothes, of grief and tearing the kingdom away from Saul. And the robe tore, and Samuel said, "The Lord has torn away the kingship from you today." So this was the end of Saul. It was 40 years, covered in 7 chapters, but it was a rough 40 years. He was not the best of kings. I would say he was a failure because he didn't finish well. It ends up where he ends up getting killed and dying in battle, and that's down the road. But in the meantime, we have a little more of this transition now between Saul and David. Saul's still king. Those first 7 chapters introduces us. Now 16 through 31 of 1 Samuel tells us a little more about Saul's kingdom, but also about David and Saul's decreasing of his influence and David's increasing of his influence. And so we have this really, this is more about David than about Saul. So chapter 17 gives us David and Goliath. And then Saul is jealous of David. The people are singing, yeah, Saul might have slain his thousands, but David has slain 10,000s, And so Saul didn't like that. He actually goes after David. He's trying to kill David, and David is running away. And at one point he acts like he's a crazy man so he can hide in a foreign land so they wouldn't kill him. Crazy stuff. Eventually Saul dies. And in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, it tells us about the death of Saul and his sons, including Jonathan. And Saul was mortally wounded, and to hasten his death, he fell on his own sword, basically. End of 40 years. So we go to 2 Samuel, and there's so much good stuff here. But let me say this briefly. 2 Samuel is all David all the time. Okay? 2 Samuel takes us from the death of Saul now has happened, David becoming the king of Israel. And first he's a king of Judah for a few years, for 7 years, and now he's the king of all of Israel. So the kingdom is a little bit split, but eventually he becomes the king of all of Israel. In chapter 5 we see that. But we see David's rise to prominence, and also David's rise in his faithfulness to God. And that's the important thing we need to remember. And what happens is Israel becomes this nation, which was a sordid confederacy, to becoming a monarchy under Saul. But now as David, they're strengthened even more, and now they're an empire. They're expanding their regions, their territories. They're taking things. They're building. They're getting rich. They're prospering. And it is really, truly a golden era of Israel during David's reign. It's a time when people can say, wow, we had a godly king who was a man after God's own heart. He messed up. Don't get that wrong. He messed up. But he was, without a doubt, a godly man. And so he does so many things. He learns from his mistakes. If you go to chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, you see the probably 11 and we get to 12 too. We see this huge turning point in David's life where he commits adultery with Uriah's wife Bathsheba. She gets pregnant, and to hide it, he tried to get Uriah to sleep with his own wife during the time of war. He brought Uriah home to do that. Uriah wouldn't do that. He was an honorable man. He wouldn't want to sleep with his wife while his countrymen are out fighting. So David puts Uriah out in the battle and puts him in the front lines and orders his general to back off. As Joab, he says, put Uriah in the front of the fiercest battle and then back off of it. And so Uriah is overwhelmed and he's killed. And he thought he got away with it. So after a period of grieving happened, Bathsheba goes to David's home. He takes her as his wife. She has this baby. He thinks it's all good. chapter 12, Nathan comes in, a prophet. Nathan is like being the Samuel to Saul. And Nathan comes in and tells him the story, but basically the parable that he tells him is about himself, is about David. And David hears this parable about some injustice that's taken place in chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. And David said, "This is horrible." And Nathan said, "I'm not talking about somebody, I'm talking about you, David." David is just dumbfounded. The difference between David's confession of sin and Saul's is like night and day. Saul said, "I have sinned against the Lord, but I was afraid of the people. I was obeying the people." David said, verse 13 of chapter 12, "I have sinned against the Lord, period." No excuse, no justification, no but. I've done it, I'm owning up to it, and God forgave him. Was there death? Was there sin? Consequences? Absolutely. There was death. The baby ended up dying. It was horrible. People ended up dying. His sons killed each other. Two of his sons died. One of his daughters was raped. I mean, this is just awful stuff that took place down the road throughout 2 Samuel. But we see this reign, and this reign of David was like this, right? And then he fell with Bathsheba, but he got right back up again, and then he had this turbulent time. Yet at the end, David was a just king who finished well, different than Saul. He finished well, and his son Solomon, who is Bathsheba's not next son, but another son of Bathsheba and David, Solomon became the next king. We're going to see in 1 Kings. So what are the themes of 1 and 2 Samuel? Well, I already talked about confederacy, monarch, and empire. I talked about how God chooses the king. And by the way, David, while Saul was good-looking, beautiful, handsome, prom king, David was ruddy, short, comparatively, probably not, but ruddy, from the field, and people underestimated him. And God said, don't look at, man looks at the externals, but I look at the heart. The 1 and 2 Samuel is where we see the fulfillment of promises. We see the promises of Israel are being seen here and being fulfilled. And we see sin and grace to those who ask for forgiveness of sin. No buts, no excuses. I did it. God have mercy, right? 1 and 2 Kings takes us to David's last days, David dying and passing on. A little bit of a struggle with power, but eventually, soon, Solomon becomes king. And his wisdom is envious around the world. He asks for wisdom from God. God said, "I'll give you anything." And he said, "I want wisdom to rule my people." And God said, "You will get that, and plus you'll get the riches." You didn't ask for it, but I'm going to give you more. I'll give you a wise, in chapter 3, verse 12 of 1 Kings, I'll give you a wise and understanding heart so that it's never been seen like anyone before or never again. And and something you didn't ask for, riches and honor. No king will be your equal your entire life. If you walk in my ways, just as your father did, I will give you a long life. David, by the way, was a king for 40 years. Saul was a king for 40 years. Solomon would be a king for 40 years. Solomon did not finish well, though. He married women upon women upon women. He had concubines. He saw the greatest of things, and he encountered the worst of things. The greatest of things was Solomon, who prayed to the Lord at the building of the temple. which was something that David had helped set up. And God just really, truly just filled the place and showed who He was. And God just, we just see this amazing moment in the history of Israel where God's Spirit is just filling the temple. And people are amazed. It's a God moment here, right? He's famous. He's well known. By end of chapter 11, he passes on, and he dies, and the kingdom then begins to be divided. And this is something that was predicted because of the sin of David. That God would not divide the kingdom until after Solomon. But Solomon's son, Rehoboam, became the king, and the people of the people of Israel said, "Hey, if your father, he was kind of tough on us. If you're a little easier on us, it would be a whole lot easier. We would follow you." And so he got the advice from the elders saying, you need to loosen up a little bit. Your father's a little too harsh. You need to be a little softer in that way. Lighten the yoke a little bit on us. And then he had the Rehoboam, who was a younger man. He went to his friends who were younger men, and he said, "What do you think, guys? What do you think? I should do? I mean, the elders say I should take it easy a little bit." The younger men in chapter 12 said, "Well, this is what you should say to the people. Your father made our yoke. I'm sorry, my father might have made my yoke heavy, but try it again. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist." In other words, if you think the yoke is heavy with my dear old dad, just wait for me. Right? Well, the people, they didn't take it too well. They heard that statement, and not only was it going to be bad, it was going to be worse. And they basically said, "Well, we have no inheritance with you, Judite, and we are not going to follow you. We are going to follow another guy." And eventually they found Jeroboam, who was a rebel. And Jeroboam ended up becoming the king of Israel, and he was an idolater. And Jeroboam was one of these guys who, as horrible as he could, he was a rebel of rebels, and as hard as he could, when the people of Israel would worship God, he would worship this false idol, just to show how rebellious he was, and led the people of Israel into a tradition of idolatry. So now there were 10 kingdoms made up of the people of Israel, okay? 10 kingdoms there. And so you had, let me draw that here. So you had, if this is Israel, you had the 10 kingdoms there in Israel, and below them, the southern kingdom was Jerusalem. This is not a bad drawing of Israel. It looks like a chicken leg to me, but that's okay. A turkey leg, maybe. So there were 10 guys here, Israel, and then in where's my mouse here? Okay, and okay, there it is. So we had 10 here, and then we had 2 down here with Judah. So you had Judah, and you had Benjamin. Okay, so you had 2 here, Judah and Benjamin, and the other 10 tribes were up there. So the kingdom was divided, and the rest of the story really takes us and tells us all about, the terrible things that take place with the people of Israel and how they rebel. We see the kings of Judah, the kings of Israel. As you go through the rest of First Kings, you're going to see all of these different kings, and some of these were good kings in Judah, some of them were not. In Israel, they're almost all bad kings, idolatrous kings. And so it's a really depressing book, and it doesn't even get as bad until we get into 2 Kings, and we'll see that in a minute. But it's pretty bad. Now, the theme that we see here is idolatry can creep up on us, and it can take different forms. And that God does judge. Despite the fact that God raised up people like Elijah, we see that in 1 Kings chapter 18, where he has this moment at Mount Carmel as he's calling out these fake gods, these false gods, and is absolutely he owns them, okay, and what he says. But in spite of that, the people still fall into worse and worse idolatry. So we get to the end of 1 Kings, and we get into 2 Kings, and we have even worse idolatry. A lot of this is going to tell us about Israel and how bad they are and how bad it goes. There's a lot about Elijah and Elisha. Elisha actually is the bulk of it, and the remarkable things. And so there's a contrast between the kings who are evil and God's prophets who are calling the people to return to the word. Now, a prophet generally is not a foreteller of the future. A prophet generally is a forthteller of God's word. So the prophetic word is go back to the law, go back to the law, go back to the law. Thus saith the Lord. This is what he says. This is your judgment. But it's usually not, hey, I'm going to predict the future. It's really, hey, this is what happened. This is what you're doing. This is what God says you need to do. That's a prophetic ministry that they did. And so we see this in Elisha more than anything, who's got double spirit of Elijah. He's a pretty powerful guy. Anyway, chapter 12, 2 Kings, Arameans come and take, well, before that, they try to take Judah. After that, we start to see the taking of Israel. I'm sorry, I got my chapters mixed up. Let's get down to it. Get down to it. There it is. So we get into chapter 17, and you see the fall of Samaria, which is another name for Israel. And in chapter 17, the nation of Assyria took them in the year, remember this, 722. We see a little later on, we get to the end of 2 Kings, and we see that Jerusalem gets destroyed in the year 586. But a lot of it, again, is they're falling into idolatry. And there are some revivals, there are some good things, but eventually what happens is they fall into this horrible cycle of idolatry. The last king, Zedekiah, who is really the last king that independent of Nebuchadnezzar. This last king, he was finally destroyed, but was horrible about him is his eyes were plucked out. But before his eyes were plucked out by Nebuchadnezzar's general, he saw them kill his sons, that would be the last thing that he saw before he lost his eyes. And boy, what a horrible consequence, right? So Nebuchadnezzar came, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the walls, tore it apart, took the leaders out, took the rich people out, took the important, educated people out, and left the people who were not really leaders in the region, so he can control them better. And so so we finish this, and there's a promise down the road of restoration, but right now it finishes with this horrible time of the fall of Israel, right? And if it ended there, it would be terrible. Now, 1st and 2nd Chronicles sounds exactly what it is. It is a chronicle, lists of a lot of what takes place in Israel. You have genealogies in there, and you see this in the first few chapters of it. It's almost grueling to read because of descendants, and you see descendants, and it's one of those. I'm now on chapter 10, and I just get into the narrative. So we got 9 chapters of begats. Okay, of course, They don't use begats in the ESV or in the CSB, but in the King James they did, right? And so you have genealogies. Why are they in the Bible? Well, they're important because these were people of faith. These are the people who God included to link the lineage, and a lineage and a history was an important part of it. They can trace their lineage all the way back to Abraham, and that was a sign of the covenant, right? That was a covenant start for them. So that was an important thing. From chapter 10 on, again, is a retelling of the story of David. Some of the details, much like the Gospels in the New Testament, different perspective. It's a retelling of the stories of David, of what took place. And then we get to Second Chronicles, curiously enough, and it goes back and it just continues on, and it goes back and it goes to back to Solomon. So we've got David and a retelling of David, followed by the retelling of Solomon, of some new stories, some same stories with different details, a little more details, a little more insight into it, and it's really good. Now, the big thing I think that we see in here, in Second Chronicles especially, we see this, is this amazing thing of chapter 5 that I alluded to in Second Samuel. No, Second Samuel. Sorry, I'm getting tired now. In chapter 5, verse number 13, it says, the trumpeters and singers joined together to praise and thank the Lord with one voice. They raised their voices in praise to the Lord, and this is what they said: for he is good, his faithful love endures forever. The temple, the Lord's temple, was filled with a cloud, and they couldn't even minister and enter it because the glory of the Lord filled the temple. This was a peak moment in the day of Israel, in the time of Israel. This is a peak time. It's an important time. And so God is just being honored, and the temple is dedicated. Beautiful moment. It relates to the chronology because all of this relates to the covenant of the people. And this is why this is important. The rest of Chronicles really does spend time, more than anything else, from the perspective of the kings of Judah. And so you might have mention of the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, but most of this time is about the kings of Judah and its hope. In contrast to the last two books that we just saw in First and Second Kings, we see hope here, and the hope here is that there's some good things, there are redeemable qualities, that there is grace that God gives, and there's things that happen that are positive. They re-celebrate the Passover again. They build the temple, and that's shown in detail. They chronicle the wonderful successes of David. Now, they pretty much ignore most of the failures of David. So he's idealized, but that's also, I think, a reason why we need to see Christ in it, because it points to a king who is a perfect king, Jesus Christ, right? David's imperfect, but it points to a perfect king, and this is a person or a type of Christ here. So there's some really great stuff, and so we have this. It ends with destruction, but we have this hope. We're left with this hope that something good is going to happen. And that something good is happening with Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, we're going to go through this real quick. Ezra, I will tell you, this is time that took place 70 years, a little less than 70 years, but 70 years after the exile begins. Babylon has come down. They've destroyed Jerusalem. Jerusalem is down in 586. Israel, Northern Kingdom, 722. This is 586. And the leaders are taken to Babylon. And Ezra is, in the meantime, what happens in the 70 years is Babylon falls to Persia, the Medes and the Persians, and the Persians are the stronger at the end, and King Cyrus of Persia then issues a proclamation, and it is to rebuild Jerusalem. So Ezra leads along with Zerubbabel, who is a descendant of the king. They are these men who are going to lead the pack to rebuild the temple. And so Ezra really is about starting the temple in the first 4 verses and then completing the temple. And then he goes back to Babylon. It goes back to where he was from, Persia. And at this point it's Persia. And then he comes back again, and there's some reforms. Now Ezra is a teacher of the law. He is in chapter 7, verse number 10, it says, Ezra had determined in his heart to study the law of the Lord, obey it, and teach the statutes and ordinances in Israel. So he was focused on the word. So he was very faithful to the word. And then we see that the temple is completed, and then they have reforms that take place. And his time when he comes back, according to the word to teach Israel, he is now reforming. Like they're taking second wives from the people that are local, that are not Israelites. He's sending them away. And how does that work? Well, it's a difficult question, but they take care of the women and the children that they have, but they're no longer their wives in the intimacy areas. So they are taking care of them without defiling and sinning. And so there's a lot that happens. So where does Nehemiah come in? The temple's done, right? That's it. Well, you got to remember, if you got a temple, right, you got to have, Jerusalem has this you've got the temple. There's right here, okay? And if the temple's right here, that's great. But any army can come and swoop down from wherever, from north, or maybe Egypt come up from here, right? So what do? Well, you fortify it with a wall, because that's what it had before. That's why Nebuchadnezzar didn't come. There's several times he tried, his generals did, but it didn't happen. So here we've got the temple here, and the temple is unprotected. So Nehemiah's job was to come down and to rebuild the walls, because he was not fearful, but he was grieving that the temple was unprotected, and all of Jerusalem was in the same way. So his job was to reform by building the temple, by making sure the city was protected, and what he does is an amazing story of leadership, by the way. My son is a pastor, and he is preaching through Nehemiah in his brand new church. He told me today he's in chapter 5 of Nehemiah, and he's taking them through Nehemiah to learn about how they need to rebuild their church. It's a revitalization church effort. But also, the other thing that we see, and by the way, Ezra is involved in this at the end. In chapter 8, we see Ezra pop in again where he's reading the word. But we also see reforms taking place. Don't cheat your fellow people of Israel. Don't cheat them. Don't charge them interest. Confess your sins before the Lord. Support the Levites. All of these things that he does for the goodness of God, the goodness of the people of Israel. And so he's fulfilling what he's supposed to do, Nehemiah is and Ezra is. And what we see God do through this is that God's promises are being fulfilled through Ezra and Nehemiah to restore Judah. 70 years after their exile, as predicted by Jeremiah, which we'll get into later on, we see a partial fulfillment. They come back from the exile. Now, they are not a new kingdom. They are still under somebody else's rule, under somebody's thumb, and it's partial, but it is a beginning and a glimpse into the future, what the future kingdom will look like. Okay? I'll give you one more. We're going to talk about Esther, because I think Esther is a great book about this, and next week we'll talk about the wisdom books and poetry, which is Job, which is fun. But quickly, the story of Esther is she is a Jewish girl living in a time where Persia was the world power and over Israel. And let me mention that God, the name, the word God, in any form of the Hebrew is not mentioned in this book. But the presence of God, the hand of God, is mentioned. Quickly, the story goes like this. Esther is this Jewish girl, and King Xerxes has a queen, Queen Vashti. Vashti is this queen who's very beautiful. But the king's word, his power, is to be respected, and when he calls upon her, she is to come. He's at a party in front of everybody, calls to her, and she doesn't come. Well, they're freaking out because it's like, okay, if she doesn't come, she's going to give an example to other wives. These men all over the country are going to lose control of their homes. They really thought this. So they said, okay, well, she's going to lose her queenship. She's no longer the queen, and so he has to look for a new queen, and he gets every night a different woman, and he gets to spend time with her, and he eventually finds that Esther, who is very beautiful, he loved her more than any others, and she becomes a queen, and he crowns her as queen. Now, in the meantime, there's this guy named Haman, who is an advisor to the king, and by the way, he is a Agagite. If you remember Saul killing, you may not have because I don't think I mentioned it. Remember that the king that Saul should have killed, Agag? He didn't. He captured the Amalekite and he lost the kingdom over it. Samuel ended up hacking Agag to pieces, but Agag had successors. He had people of his own. Haman was an Agagite, which is very interesting. And he was this guy who was one of the advisors to the king, and actually one of the most important advisors to the king, and had an ego the size of the city. Mordecai, Esther's uncle, who raised Esther, would not pay Haman any respect, and Haman hated it. He wanted to kill Mordecai. Mordecai, through some events, saved the king, and there's some kind of plot against the king, and Mordecai made it known and saved the king, which was amazing. So anyway, Haman has this plan, and the plan is he hated Mordecai. Haman hated Mordecai so much, he wanted to wipe all of Mordecai's people off the face of the planet. He did not know the relationship between Esther and Mordecai. And through several events, eventually, what Haman wanted to do is he wanted to destroy all of the people of Israel, give permission to destroy all the people of Israel, and the king signed it, and it couldn't be broken, because he said they were rebellious, blah, blah, blah. Well, the end result of this is, before that happened, Esther had to speak up for her people. And she did. And she approached the king. Now, just as the queen needed to, if she was asked by the king to come, she had to come. The other part of it is she could never go to the king unless she was summoned. And if she did, she could lose her life unless the king held up a scepter and pointed it at her and gave her mercy. She could not approach the king unless he gave her mercy and allowed her in his presence. Very godlike, right? Very godlike. And it's pointing, obviously, to Christ here. She approached the king, and the king held up the scepter so she could speak. And he said, "What is it?" And she said, "I'd like to give a dinner in honor of Haman. Um, um, and I'd like to." And the king said, "I'll give you half the kingdom. What do you want?" And she said, "I just want you to, have a banquet that I've prepared." And so the king and Haman do it. Haman's like, "Oh, I'm going to be honored. This is good stuff. This is great." Um, well, eventually, Esther reveals what happened, who she was, and how Haman is going after her people. And Haman is freaking out. He built this gallows that he had set up for Mordecai, and eventually Haman ends up in the gallows. Okay, now I gave you a really rough overview of Esther, but here's what happens. Esther intervenes for her own people. She is set for such a time as this. She is the woman who reveals that she is one of them. She actually allows her people to defend themselves, and she gets the king to agree, well, I can't change the rules about the people killing the Jews, but I can let the Jews defend themselves. So he allowed the Jews to defend themselves and saved the people as a result. Mordecai ended up being honored because the king realized, hey, earlier on, he realized, hey, you saved me. And so there's so much to this story that I didn't touch on. Here's the point of this whole story. God is in charge of his people. He is over his people. He is not limited to working on behalf of his people in the land of Israel, all over the world. Second is, God is there and everywhere, even when he seems to be absent. And in the case of Esther, we don't hear the name of God, but boy, God is everywhere in this particular part of this book, so, and of the Bible, and you can see God and you can point it to Christ. I hope this is helpful. I hope this overview was helpful to the history of the books of the Bible. We're going to talk next week. We'll talk about poetry and wisdom. We're going to spend some time in that. I love the discussions you're having. I'm trying to comment and challenge you. Please look for my questions back to you as I ask you questions. If you have questions about anything, feel free to call, text, email me. I'd be glad to respond to you, okay? All right, we will see you. I'll see you on the discussion boards. Take care. Bye-bye.